This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by the 24th Bioequity Europe, scheduled for May 2024 in San Sebastian, Spain. Join BioCentury EBD Group and Regional Host Committee Chair Isios Capital for biotech's premier CEO and investor conference in one of the culinary capitals of the world.
Hello, I'm Steve Usdin, Washington editor of BioCentury, and today I'm joined by Eva Temkin, a partner at the law firm King Spalding. I've asked her to speak with me today because she's got important insights into lawsuits that could have profound impacts on the way drugs are regulated in the United States. Before joining King Spalding in 2021, Eva was an attorney and policymaker at FDA. Most recently, she was one of the authors of amicus briefs in litigation in front of the Supreme Court involving the abortion drug mifepristone. We're going to discuss the mifepristone case and what it could mean for FDA and companies that develop medicines. We'll also talk about another case the Supreme Court will decide this term involving challenges to what's called the Chevron Doctrine and litigation that's likely to end up at the Supreme Court at some point involving the Inflation Reduction Act's Medicare drug price negotiation program. Eva, let's start with the mifepristone case. Your brief argues that quite apart from its impact on access to abortion drugs, it could have broad implications for FDA and for drug companies. But before we get into that, can you just back up and let us know, remind us, what's the case about? Who's suing who and why?
Sure, Steve. It's got a very long and complicated history, and in fact, the drug itself originally was approved way back in 2000, so almost 24 years ago now. When FDA approved the drug in 2000, it did so under specific regulatory authorities that existed at the time under FDA's regulations that the agency used to impose restrictions and to assure safe use on specific products. And that included restrictions on where the drug could be dispensed and by whom and where the drug could be administered. And importantly for the case, the types of adverse event reporting that prescribers were required to undertake in conjunction with mifepristone. So those restrictions were embodied at the time of the approval, again, more than 2 decades ago, known as Subpart H. And I have to say, Subpart H is the same part of FDA's regulations that contain the accelerated approval provisions. I think there's been a lot of confusion in this case because Subpart H contains both the distribution restriction provisions and the accelerated approval provisions. But it is worth keeping in mind that Mifeprex, the brand name of the drug, was not an accelerated approval drug. In fact, it was an exceptionally long, tedious, and thorough review process. In 2007, Congress codified FDA's authority to impose those distribution restrictions in what became known as the Mifeprex REMS, or Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy. So in 2011, officially, FDA approved the REMS for Mifeprex. And going forward over time, as FDA is required to do under the statute, the agency monitored the REMS and made periodic changes. It's those changes that are going to be at issue in the Supreme Court and when we see briefs and when we hear oral argument in a couple of months. Most significantly, in 2016, FDA loosened certain of the restrictions, including those related to physician-only administration and in-office healthcare provider visits, and those requiring prescribers to report adverse events, in addition to the adverse event reporting imposed on all drug manufacturers. On this latter point, we have to keep in mind that this change did not impact the sponsor's responsibility to report adverse event information to FDA. Consistent with FDA regulations, all approved drugs have the same obligations. Fast forward again to 2021, during the COVID-19 public health emergency, when people really couldn't go see their healthcare providers, FDA said that it would exercise enforcement discretion with respect to the in-person requirements. The requirement in particular that mifepristone be dispensed only in person by a healthcare provider. As kind of a side note, the formal agency action on this point came only after the litigation was filed, but it's still action that would be walked back, and we'll talk about what the Supreme Court has in front of it that would be walked back if the Supreme Court permits the Fifth Circuit's opinion to stand.
And you've said what the Supreme Court's deciding, but actually the original case, we go back to the case, what the judge in Amarillo, Texas, Matthew Kaczmarek ruled on, that was about the original approval of the drug, right?
Exactly right. Yeah. So AHM filed its original lawsuit feels like a long time ago now, in November 2022, challenging essentially 3 different FDA actions: the original approval of mifepristone back in 2000, the supplement that changed the healthcare provider and some other distribution restrictions in 2016, and the decision by FDA in 2021 to exercise enforcement discretion.
And the people who sued were emergency room physicians, right?
They are physicians in an association, and I believe that they are all emergency room physicians, although I haven't looked at all of their resumes specifically. It's important, I think, standing, and the question of, these plaintiffs' ability to bring this lawsuit is a big part of the case. It's a big question mark before the Supreme Court. It's one of the questions presented in the petitions for certiorari that the Supreme Court granted. There was some additional activity happening just yesterday on standing in the Supreme Court, with state interveners looking to file briefs in the Supreme Court now to argue their own views of standing. So it is an interesting idea. And from an industry perspective, I'll tell you a very troubling one, that physicians who by their own statements have no intention of prescribing this drug can bring a lawsuit challenging the nationwide approval standard.
So what they argued is, they said that someday they may have to treat a woman who has had an adverse effect related to this drug, and therefore they have standing to sue to overturn its approval. And my understanding is, right, that the judge in Texas agreed with them. Then it went up to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which agreed and didn't agree, right?
The Fifth Circuit also agreed that they had standing. The Fifth Circuit found that their challenge to the original 2000 approval was time barred, and so it didn't take on that original approval. It focused its analysis on the 2016 and 2021 actions.
And that was lifting the restrictions on its distribution, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that FDA shouldn't have done that, and now it's gone up to the Supreme Court. You argue in the case, in your brief, that if this ruling goes against the FDA, that it's going to have implications that are more broad, right? Can
Absolutely.
You talk about that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Steve. I think the view of the group that we represent in the Supreme Court and have represented along the way takes the position, and I personally agree with it very, very much, that the impact of this case is not going to be limited to just this one drug. In fact, we think it would have really wide-reaching reverberations throughout the biopharma industry. We can talk about the specifics, but I think the overall impact of the Fifth Circuit's opinion being permitted to stand would be a lot of uncertainty and destabilizing impact on industry and on investment. Our amicus group includes a lot of investors as well who are concerned about their investment in biopharma. And I think that's why you've seen this massive show of concern from industry.
So you've got really kind of like a who's who of the biotech industry and the biopharma industry on your brief. And am I right? And basically, if you kind of to oversimplify it, the concern is that if this case is ruled against FDA, that just about anybody could sue the FDA for any decision that's made. They could say, well, we didn't think FDA should have approved COVID drugs, or Narcan to reverse opioid overdoses, and then they could find some judge somewhere who agrees with them, and then they're off to the races, and we've got this great deal of uncertainty. Is that kind of what it's about?
Yeah, mostly. I think I break it down into 2 kind of different but related questions. One is this standing question, right? The Fifth Circuit had a really expansive analysis of standing. And if that analysis is endorsed, it effectively would mean that any physician could ask a judge to undermine patient access to any drug across the country at any time. Like, this is a drug that's been approved for more than 2 decades. It has a long history of safe use. And without really, it doesn't really matter what the indication of the drug is. What matters is that those plaintiffs could ask the judge to overturn approval 20, 30, who knows how many years after the approval, and whether or not the physician even prescribes the drug in question. So I think that's a pretty big deal when you think about the liability risk that industry takes on. And then I also think there's a real miscomprehension or misunderstanding in the part of the lower courts of how critical flexibility is in drug development and how important it is to facilitate drug development, that sponsors and the reviewing agency, in this case FDA, be able to use its scientific expertise to shape programs and what data is needed and what clinical trials look like and how FDA's gold standard of safety and efficacy is met.
Because, and you're saying that, I think because in the original decision in Texas, the judge said, well, FDA did, the label didn't adhere 100% to the clinical trial, and therefore it was illegal. But no label, I think, adheres 100% to the clinical trials. That's the misconception.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's no scientific debate, I think, at all that clinical trials are not intended to, nor do they perfectly mirror real world use conditions. Especially early in drug development, there are safeguards put in place on clinical trials that are not intended to stay there. There are all kinds of mechanisms that clinical trial developers use to drown out noise, to make sure that we get clear, usable data. And that's just not the reality of real world use of drugs. And I can I add one other thing, Steve, which is it wasn't just Judge Kaczmarek that would deny that flexibility, right? He did do that analysis in the context of the 2000 approval, but the Fifth Circuit also, in looking at the 2016 and 2021 decisions, really called into question the way that FDA approves changes to labels, the way that sponsors can update and modernize kind of as science evolves.
So I spoke with a number of attorneys about this case, and one of them was Dan Troy, the former chief counsel at FDA. And he said, look, that it's a tactical mistake to focus, to say that this has got these broad implications, that it would be better for FDA and better for the biopharma industry if you just said, look, this case is just about this one drug, and you can limit it to that. And whatever the Supreme Court does there, it doesn't affect the whole scheme for regulating drugs. What's your response to that?
This is not how I read the opinions. I don't think that the Fifth Circuit's analysis or the district court's analysis is specific to this drug. What those courts did was take FDA to task for the way that FDA reviewed and analyzed scientific information. And that is what is so unprecedented about this case. And that is why it has such broad implications, because it's not about the treatment of this one case. It's about how FDA determines safety and effectiveness and how FDA uses its scientific judgment. I mean, we're going to talk about Chevron a little bit later, but the idea of deference to scientific analysis by FDA is really important for the stability of industry. And the idea that a drug approval can be overturned based on a judge's non-expert quibble with the scientific determination that the agency made, in my mind, is not very limited at all.
And that is a good segue. We're going to have to take a quick break here, but when we get back, I want to talk about the Chevron case, and it's really what its implications are for exactly what you're talking about, whether it's FDA and its scientific expertise that makes decisions, or it's judges who get to make decisions about critical things like whether a drug has met the standard for approval or not. We'll be right back in a minute to talk about that.
For more than 20 years, BioEquity Europe has been where CEOs and investors gather to network, partner, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. In 2024, BioEquity heads to San Sebastian, Spain, in Basque Country. May 12th to 14th. Join BioCentury EBD Group and Regional Host Committee Chair Isios Capital in one of the world's culinary capitals for a destination event designed for CEOs, investors, and decision makers across the global biopharma ecosystem. In 2023, 300 VCs and 330 biotech CEOs joined BioEquity in Dublin, Ireland. In San Sebastian, the program will feature more than 100 emerging biotechs that will present their story to investors and potential partners. Don't wait, last year's BioEquity conference sold out. Visit bioequityeurope.com for more information.
We're back with Eva Temkin, a partner at King Spalding, talking about the law and FDA. Chevron Doctrine. Okay, that's what's that about, and how is it important for FDA and for drug regulation?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion coming out of the oral argument last week about the Chevron cases. We're talking about, I think, both the Loper Bright and Relentless cases, and I think it's here again you see the court struggling with deference to the agency. In my opinion, this is a very different context from the AHM case, the case we were just talking about. That case is about scientific and technical decision-making and deference. And, I don't think there's a court in the world that is equipped to make the kinds of complex scientific and technical decisions that FDA medical doctors and scientists make as part of drug development, as those programs evolved. The Loper Bright and Relentless cases are about Chevron deference, that is, deference to agency decision-making in the regulatory context, right? So the holding of Chevron was that courts should defer to an agency's reasonable interpretation of ambiguous statutory language. So on the one hand, we're talking about, the AHM context, we're talking about a court applying arbitrary and capricious review, and those courts not substituting their own non-expert judgment for agency expertise. In the Chevron cases, we're talking about deference in the rulemaking context to agency interpretations of statutory language.
So the basic idea, and maybe again to oversimplify it, the conservative movement and conservative judges on the Supreme Court seem to agree with this idea that that this case is important for dealing a blow to what they call the administrative state. The idea that unelected officials are making decisions that should have been in the purview of Congress. Ironically, one of the outcomes of this seems to be that unelected officials who are judges are going to get the power instead of executive agencies. But anyway, the idea is that if the Congress should specify what the agency should do, and if there's a doubt about that, then judges are equipped to make a decision about how agencies should interpret the law, rather than getting deference, which is what the Chevron case said. And it does seem to me that there's an overlap here with the FDA. I wrote about that before the case, and then I was really pleased and surprised that two of the Supreme Court justices brought up FDA law as examples of what they thought could happen if the Chevron doctrine is overturned. So Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson noted that the law requires that in order to be approved, a drug has to be tested in an adequate and well-controlled investigation. And then she said that, FDA is the one who should decide that, not judges. The attorney who was arguing the case for overturning Chevron said, no, actually, that's a legal definition, and a judge should be able to make that interpretation. Where do you think the Supreme Court could go with this? Could they actually say that that judges across the country are equipped and are the appropriate people to make these kinds of decisions?
It's a really, really good question, Steve, and I get nervous thinking about it, just because the implications for the industry that I care so much about and work in are so potentially large. I don't think there's a need for the Supreme Court to take on that kind of deference in order to decide these cases. Remember, these are cases about, I think, who must bear the costs of fees related to phishing monitors. They are not questions about scientific deference. And so I'm hopeful that the court won't quite go that far. And I think there's a reasonable middle ground between what you're describing, which, Justice Jackson's question about adequate and well-controlled trials kind of teed up. The agency won't, even if the agency, in the absence of Chevron, wouldn't get deference with respect to what does an adequate and well-controlled trial mean under the FDCA or Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as a legal matter. And for context, FDA's regulations do outline the contours. I mean, there are regulations in Part 314 that define what characteristics FDA views as clearly included within the boundaries of adequate and well-controlled study. But on the other hand, it seems clearly impossible for a court to determine whether a specific study protocol is adequate and well-controlled, any more than a court could determine whether a specific new drug application includes substantial evidence of efficacy. Those are scientific determinations. And I think there's a middle ground there, and I think that the court should really resist going quite that far and should try to thread this needle to the extent that they're going to overturn Chevron.
So taking it from the other point of view, though, I think there are people who would look at this and say, well, FDA could make the wrong decision. Arguably, people would argue that some of the decisions that FDA has made are the wrong. Even people at FDA sometimes think that other parts of FDA have made the wrong decision. And people look at this and say, well, shouldn't they be able to bring this up before a judge to make their case?
Yeah, and everybody makes mistakes. I wouldn't argue that FDA should never be challenged, or that there shouldn't be appeals processes, which there are, or that they shouldn't be held to the standards that they're held to. But I do think there's a distinction between challenging FDA's interpretation of law and challenging the really granular decisions that FDA reviewers are making on a daily basis in order to advance drug development. And my sort of granular take on this comes from working at FDA, sitting with review teams in those meetings, watching them work and understanding how many scientific disciplines have to come together. You're talking, clinicians, biostatisticians, pharmacokinetic experts, toxicologists, and even with those incredibly well-versed groups of people, they still are convening advisory committees, right? There's a huge amount of thought that goes into the scientific analysis. And I just don't see a world in which a court can make those kinds of decisions. As a lawyer in those rooms, I wouldn't have wanted to make those decisions. I could look at that conversation and say, well, here are the legal guardrails, right? Here are the boundaries that you have to stay in. Here are the analyses that you have to do. But I'm not going to say whether a huge data set generated from 4,000 patients shows that a particular endpoint is valid. That's not my job any more than it is a court's job. And so I think ultimately, in order for drug development and the incredibly complex and innovative things that are happening, look at gene therapies, look at the novel drugs that are being developed out there. It's so exciting, and we need those things to keep happening so that patients have access to medicine. I don't think that job can ultimately fall to a non-expert court.
Well, we'll see whether the Supreme Court has the same level of humility about this as you do. The IRA, I have to preface my questions to you about the IRA by pointing out that your firm is representing one of the parties that's suing the government, Novo Nordisk, over the IRA. So that might constrain what you can say a little bit, but also gives you some special insight into it, I think. My interpretation of it is that there's kind of two buckets for these lawsuits. There's one set of issues which are constitutional challenges, and there's another which are more administrative, or how CMS and HHS have applied the law. Is generally speaking, is that an accurate way to sum it up?
Yeah, I think that's right. There are currently, I believe, 9 ongoing litigations pertaining to the IRA. Most of them were initiated before the release of the selected drug list for the initial price applicability year of 2026. That list came out last September. And so most of those litigations are challenging the IRA on its face, arguing against the law's constitutionality as a facial matter. There are a handful of others that are challenging the IRA as applied to a particular selected drug.
And what are the so to take those two in their parts, what are the constitutional arguments that are being made against the Medicare drug prescription drug negotiation program?
They really run the gamut. The arguments go from free speech, due process, there are takings arguments, excessive fines arguments, separation of powers, unconstitutional conditions, and legislative authority vis-a-vis the excise tax arguments. And then on the APA side, there are arguments related to the procedural defects in the way that CMS is implementing the law, and arguments that the agency's implementation itself goes well beyond its statutory authority.
APH is the Administrative Procedures Act.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So when do you think that we are going to start seeing some decisions? And we've seen one decision, I guess, already in the Chamber of Commerce case that went against the people who were the parties that were challenging the law, but that case is still continuing. When do you think we'll start seeing decisions and getting a sense of where this is going?
I don't have great insight into the timing of all of the cases. I think the first argument or the next argument that is scheduled is next week on January 31st in the District of Delaware. And beyond that, I think we should start to see, we have fully briefed motions in a number and ongoing briefing in motions in a number of other ones. So I would expect to start seeing decisions this year. But I don't really have a crystal ball into that, unfortunately. I wish I did.
And do you think that we'll see more litigation after we find out in September what the prices are? How the negotiations went. Will that trigger another set of litigation? It
might. It very well might. Yeah.
Well, I guess we're gonna have an exciting time following all of these cases. And I said at the beginning that I thought that this is going to end up at the Supreme Court. Do you think that's likely?
I do think eventually it will wend its way up to the Supreme Court. It might take a little while to get there. And I think, I'll offer you one sort of spin on what might also, in addition to what all of the arguments that we just talked about, ultimately end up in the Supreme Court, which is that, and of course, this is my bias as an FDA lawyer. I actually think in the IRA implementation, sort of similarly to the Chevron case and the AHM case, which are also questioning FDA's role, right? And sort of poking at the purview of the FDA as the sole scientific arbiter in this space. Here you see FDA's sister agency, CMS, also taking on roles that historically and very importantly have been in the purview of the FDA.
What do you mean by that?
Things like therapeutic equivalence, therapeutic alternatives, or whether one drug is clinically superior to another drug, which is a careful analysis that FDA does in the orphan drug space. And even things like when a biological product might be considered first licensed, or what the active ingredient might be for a biological product under the Public Health Service Act. CMS's implementation of the IRA is filled with kind of departures from what is considered standard practice in the drug development space built by FDA. And so I think we'll see pressure as those conflicts come to light and as pipelines are challenged by this, I don't want to say divergence, but maybe tension between the way that drugs typically and historically have been developed under the FDA paradigm and the way that the IRA is pushing.
And so it's really, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, again, there's two sets of kind of topics there. There's one, which are the criteria that CMS uses to determine the relative value of a drug, what its price should be, and for example, what drugs it compares it to, and so on. And the other is the timing of when a drug is subject or potentially subject to price regulation.
That's right. And I might even add a third bucket, Steve, which would be sort of big policy considerations, right? So I'll go back to the example of orphan drugs, but FDA has spent decades, the Orphan Drug Act was passed, I think, in 1983. And probably even before that, really the agency being FDA, has prioritized rare disease drug development and sought to really catalyze investment and development in that space. Now the IRA comes along. The statute actually includes an exemption from price controls for orphan designated drugs, but CMS has taken on a pretty narrow interpretation of guidance under which orphan drug designation of more than one indication sort of disqualifies the orphan product from the exemption. And so you all of a sudden see a real disincentive being imposed on development, on rare disease drug development, at the same time that FDA is still trying to catalyze, and patients obviously really need drugs in that space. So you see these sort of policy disconnects in addition to the two that you just mentioned.
And that's probably going to end up in Congress's lap. At least I know that there are parties that are trying to get Congress to resolve that issue, at least on the orphan drug issue. Well, that's all the time that we've got today. But I really thank you for shedding some light on some really complicated topics that are going to be they're really going to determine, I think, the ability of the FDA to regulate drugs going forward, and the ability of companies to develop innovative drugs. So, we'll be watching this space. I'll be calling you up and asking you what's happening going forward over the next few months.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for having me. It was really a pleasure to talk.
Brought to you by the 24th BioEquity Europe, scheduled for May 2024 in San Sebastian, Spain. Join BioCentury EBD Group and Regional Host Committee Chair Isios Capital for biotech's premier CEO and investor conference in one of the culinary capitals of the world.